Winter in 1875 descended over Missouri and Kansas like a silent predator, blanketing the land in frost and unease. 7 years had passed since the boy named Timothy Caldwell vanished from the Missouri State Hospital, yet the echoes of his darkness had not faded. In the quiet towns of Kansas, whispers began circulating, stories of elderly men and women dying under the care of a young, polite, unnervingly composed caregiver calling himself Thomas Whitfield. At first, the deaths seemed natural. Strokes, heart failures, the slow decay of age. But the frequency, the uncanny timing, the precision, it stirred an unease even in the most rational minds. Thomas Whitfield was not merely a caregiver. He was a study in deceptive brilliance. 19 years old, speaking with a fluency that suggested years of formal education, yet claiming only the tutelage of a country doctor in Missouri. His hands moved with clinical grace, yet his eyes, those pale, piercing eyes, held a cold curiosity, a calculating awareness that made those who watched him instinctively recoil. Families praised him for his compassion, for the gentle ease he brought to their dying relatives, unaware that the very trust they extended was his weapon, the instrument of his art. Dr. Benjamin Wheeler, a physician in Leavenworth County, was the first to sense the pattern. When Thomas delivered the death certificate for Mrs. Martha Henley, an elderly woman who had suffered months of consumption, Wheeler noted the boy's detachment. Where grief should have resided, there was only interest. Questions about cause of death, investigation methods, documentation procedures. Innocuous to a casual observer, but to Wheeler, each inquiry felt like a probe, a mapping of opportunity, an experiment in understanding vulnerability. And yet, Thomas's work was impeccable. He soothed, administered care, prepared families for endings that were already written in the bodies of those he tended. There is a peculiar danger in brilliance disguised as innocence. In Thomas Whitfield, the Midwest had unknowingly welcomed a predator who understood human empathy better than most men. He moved through farmhouses like a shadow, observing, calculating, waiting. Patients who were already frail succumbed with frightening regularity under his care, and Thomas vanished before suspicion could find him. By the time authorities pieced together his movements, weeks or months later, the trail had already gone cold. And yet, there was something even more chilling. The boy had evolved. The Timothy Caldwell who had tortured animals in hidden caves, the boy who had fascinated adults with his cruelty and cleverness, had learned to cloak his impulses, to channel them through a veneer of utility, kindness, even heroism. He had transformed from a mere experimenter in death to a strategist in human trust. The story that begins here is not simply about murder. It is about the way darkness can grow, hidden in plain sight, using the tools of society against itself. It is about manipulation, about the exploitation of expectation, about the human tendency to trust appearances over truth. And it is about how one boy, once considered merely strange, became a force that no one could see coming, until it was already too late. Kansas in 1875 was still a land of quiet desperation. The Civil War's shadow had faded, but its scars lingered in the bodies and minds of those left behind. Farmers, widows, and elderly veterans struggled with infirmities no one wanted to face. Into this fragile landscape, Thomas Whitfield moved with the precision of a predator and the charm of a savior. He was young, polite, and remarkably capable, a combination that disarmed suspicion before it could take root. Families saw only what they wanted to see: a compassionate hand, a knowledgeable guide through the final stages of life. But beneath the veneer lay something far older, far darker. Thomas selected his victims not randomly, but strategically. He sought those whose lives were already on the edge, those whose deaths could be plausibly explained as the natural progression of age, illness, or misfortune. He studied each patient's environment, each family dynamic, each vulnerability. He watched how grief altered behavior, how trust could be manipulated, how fear could be planted without ever being seen. In every household, he became both participant and observer, healer and executioner, a man who understood that the most dangerous power is the power no one admits exists: control over life and death without detection. Dr. Wheeler documented the first disturbing patterns. Mrs. Henley, Samuel Morrison, dozens of others. Each death followed Thomas's presence like a shadow. Weeks passed. Thomas would warn families of impending decline with unsettling accuracy, preparing them for endings that were never delayed. And when those endings came, he was gone, or seemed to be elsewhere in the house, detached, professional, almost innocent. Yet every question he asked about death certificates, investigation procedures, and evidence gathering suggested a mind obsessed not with care, but with understanding how systems fail. He was mapping the boundaries of what society allowed, discovering how far he could bend trust before suspicion ignited. By midsummer, whispers had begun, though no one yet connected the dots. The boy who had once disappeared from Missouri now walked openly among the living, wearing the mask of civility. His presence was comforting. His methods were precise, and his curiosity, that silent, calculating observation, promised that what had begun as a boy's cruel experiments was evolving into something systematic, something almost surgical in its execution. What makes true darkness terrifying is not its visibility, it is its invisibility. Thomas Whitfield could sit beside you, speak to you, offer for comfort, and yet simultaneously be planning, calculating, learning. Each household was his laboratory, each patient his subject, each death a lesson in refinement. He was no longer just a boy, he was a strategist of mortality, a master of human expectation, and the world around him remained blissfully unaware. And as the deaths continued, as families mourned and whispered thanks for his care, one question lingered in the shadows: how long before the world realized that the boy science could not explain had not disappeared, but had simply been hiding in plain sight, sharpening his craft? The town of Oskaloosa was quiet in August 1875, but beneath that serene surface, the air carried unease that few could name. Reverend Jonathan Hartwell, a man of 67 years, had spent decades guiding souls, counseling families, and seeing through the facades people wore. His body, weakened by what doctors called a failing heart, could not conceal the sharpness of his mind. And when Thomas Whitfield arrived as his caregiver, Hartwell sensed something no one else could: the gaze of a predator who did not merely observe, but catalogued, calculated, and anticipated. Thomas moved through the Reverend's home with the same careful efficiency he had perfected in dozens of previous households. He measured medications, adjusted bedding, and maintained routines that seemed designed to comfort. But all the while he was watching. Every glance, every sigh, every unspoken fear was recorded in the boy's mind, folded into a ledger of knowledge that would guide his next move. And Hartwell, unusually observant, noticed the subtleties: a hesitation in Thomas's step, a lingering stare at a closed door, a hand twitch when the Reverend shifted in his bed. It was a look not of care but of study, clinical, deliberate, cold. The Reverend began to warn his daughter, Elizabeth. His words were hesitant at first, the caution of a man unsure if his instincts were paranoia or truth. But as days passed, his certainty grew. Thomas's questions about the family's finances, the church's donations, the small safes and drawers where cash and valuables were kept, seemed irrelevant to caregiving. And yet, they were asked with the same calm, polite inflection as if discussing the weather. Hartwell described to Elizabeth a gaze that sent shivers down his spine, detached, calculating, as if he were watching not a man, but an experiment, a specimen under careful study. One night, the Reverend awoke to the faint sound of movement. He saw Thomas standing beside his bed, not administering medicine, not adjusting his blankets, but simply observing. Hartwell's heart raced, not from weakness, but from the certainty that he had glimpsed the truth: this boy was dangerous. Thomas waited for something. What Hartwell could not know, but the intent in those pale eyes was unmistakable. Fear was not enough. He needed to act, to ensure that Elizabeth never left him alone with Thomas again. The unsettling thing about predators like Thomas, that they are invisible until their overconfidence exposes them. He had become so skilled, so practiced, so sure of his disguise, that he began to make mistakes, small ones imperceptible to most, but glaring to someone like Hartwell. A miscalculation, a linger too long, a question asked at the wrong time. These cracks would eventually widen, revealing the monster behind the polite veneer. And in those quiet, oppressive rooms of the Hartwell house, the line between care and malevolence blurred. Every gesture of assistance was laced with the potential for harm. Every moment of trust was an invitation for manipulation. And yet, Thomas Whitfield continued, confident that the Reverend's suspicions were harmless, that no one could piece together the careful choreography of death he had been perfecting for years. August 15, 1875, began like any other summer morning in Oskaloosa, but for Reverend Hartwell it would become the day that split his world into before and after. The room was quiet, still almost reverent, as if the house itself sensed what was about to unfold. Hartwell had been restless during the night, aware of a presence he could not fully explain. Thomas Whitfield had not merely been a caregiver, he had been a watcher, a man studying his patient as if the very act of life and death were his personal laboratory. That morning, the veil of civility finally slipped. Elizabeth was in the kitchen, attending to breakfast, when a soft, suppressed gasp, pulled her toward her father's room. She ran, her heart pounding, only to see Thomas hovering over Hartwell's bed, a pillow pressed against the Reverend's face. Time slowed in those moments. The air thickened, each second stretching as Elizabeth screamed. Hartwell struggled beneath the weight, gasping for air, the knowledge of betrayal striking deeper than the pillow itself. The boy's gaze was steady, unflinching, almost clinical. He wasn't angry. He wasn't panicked. He was analyzing. Elizabeth lunged, yanking the pillow away. Hartwell coughed, clawing for oxygen, his body trembling with a combination of fear and rage. Thomas, caught in an instant of overconfidence, stepped back, raising his hands in a gesture of innocence so rehearsed it almost fooled the untrained eye. I was only adjusting his pillow, he stammered, voice calm, composed, as if rehearsed in 1,000 imaginary trials. But the truth could not be hidden behind words. Hartwell, weak though he was, knew exactly what had been attempted. He had stared into the eyes of a killer. Wheeler, summoned immediately, confronted the impossible. A respected, intelligent young man, widely praised for his caregiving, accused of attempted murder in broad daylight. Yet Thomas's reputation was impeccable, his demeanor convincing. How could one argue against the evidence of professionalism and competence? How could the community accept the Reverend's word over the polite, articulate caregiver who had become indispensable? This was the cruel brilliance of Thomas Whitfield. He had weaponized trust itself, but it was precisely this overreach, the audacity of pressing boundaries too far, that would mark the beginning of his unraveling. Hartwell's observation, his unyielding insight, provided the first clear glimpse into the methodology behind Thomas's crimes. Every household he had entered, every death he had orchestrated, followed a pattern of invisible manipulation, of calculated control, of silence enforced by the illusion of care. And yet, now under the Reverend's scrutiny, cracks appeared in that meticulously constructed mask. What most fail to understand about predators like Thomas is that their genius is inseparable from their arrogance. The same confidence that allowed him to manipulate entire families also made him believe he could escape the perception of the truly perceptive. And when arrogance meets vigilance, the predator becomes visible, even to those around him who had trusted him without question. In the days following the attempted smothering, the fragile calm of Oskaloosa shattered. Dr. Wheeler, a man of reason and experience, began to connect threads that had once seemed isolated. 17 deaths in less than 6 months. Each death carefully timed. Each patient chosen for frailty or illness. Each household left believing in the boy's compassion, in his innocence. And now, with Reverend Hartwell nearly escaping a deliberate killing, the pattern could no longer be ignored. Wheeler realized the terrifying truth: this was not random misfortune. This was methodical, calculated, and far beyond the understanding of local authorities. Thomas Whitfield, the boy who had once vanished from Missouri, had learned to cloak himself in society's most trusted role, the caregiver. He understood human psychology on a level that seemed unnatural. He knew how to appeal to empathy, to instill confidence, to exploit grief and gratitude. Families willingly invited him into the most vulnerable corners of their lives, unknowingly giving him access not just to their homes, but to their control over life itself. And Thomas moved with a precision that was almost surgical. He studied each patient's routine, measured their habits, mapped their vulnerabilities. Every death under his care seemed inevitable, natural, ordained by illness rather than orchestrated by him. Yet arrogance, as Wheeler would soon see, was Thomas's weakness. He had grown so confident in his ability to manipulate, in the invisibility of his work, that subtle mistakes began to emerge. Questions asked too pointedly. Observations made in plain sight. Curiosity in the wrong place, at the wrong time. Hartwell's insight had been a revelation, a glimpse into the meticulous mind behind the mask. Wheeler began to catalogue these errors, to trace them back through months of deaths, and slowly, the structure of a monstrous strategy began to reveal itself. Word spread quietly among counties. Families whispered about the boy who seemed everywhere, whose presence always coincided with loss. Authorities were skeptical at first. After all, death was inevitable among the elderly and infirm. But as reports accumulated, the pattern became impossible to dismiss. Dr. Wheeler, armed with Hartwell's testimony, began contacting neighboring physicians, local officials, anyone who might hold fragments of the puzzle. Across Missouri, Nebraska, and Colorado, strange reports surfaced: young caregivers, impeccable references, patients dying under suspicious circumstances, and the caregivers vanishing before questions could form. And then came the telegram from Dr. Samuel Harding, the man who had first documented Timothy Caldwell's early exploits in Missouri. His words were terse, cryptic, yet urgent. Stop investigating immediately. Stop boy from Sedalia. Case stop, extremely dangerous. Stop will arrive Kansas soonest. Stop. Harding's warning was chilling not because it revealed danger, but because it hinted at the immensity of the threat. Thomas Whitfield was no ordinary killer. He was the grown version of a boy who had understood cruelty on a level few adults ever could, and had refined that cruelty into a systematic, almost invisible art. The investigation had only just begun, and already it became clear what had once been studied as anomalies, tragic deaths, misfortune, bad luck, was in reality the careful orchestration of a mind that had been waiting years for the perfect environment to evolve, to manipulate, and to exploit human trust with terrifying precision. 3 days after Harding's urgent telegram, the air of Oskaloosa grew heavier, as if the land itself sensed the arrival of the man who had first unraveled the truth about Timothy Caldwell. Dr. Samuel Harding stepped off the train, carrying leather-bound journals, decades of meticulous notes, and a grim understanding of the boy who had vanished 7 years earlier. The same boy, he now feared, had re-emerged as Thomas Whitfield, a man who had learned to blend into society while perfecting his craft of death. Harding moved quickly, aware that every hour Thomas remained free was another life at risk. His first stop was Reverend Hartwell's home, where the attempted smothering had occurred. Harding interviewed the Reverend with painstaking care, every question designed to reconstruct events with clinical precision. Hartwell described Thomas's gaze, the unnatural composure, the detached interest in suffering, the same patterns Harding had observed years before in Timothy Caldwell. The boy who had once delighted in torturing farm animals, who had fascinated and horrified adults with his intelligence, had become a man who weaponized empathy itself. The clinical detachment, the meticulous attention to detail, the cold curiosity in human suffering, all the characteristics of a predator refined over years of careful observation, were now unmistakably present in Thomas Whitfield. Harding's eyes scanned the room, noting details the casual observer might miss: the pale blue eyes, the slight build, the scar on the left hand, marks that linked the boy from Missouri to the man now walking among them. Every piece of evidence aligned with the nightmare he had feared for 7 long years. Hartwell had survived, barely, and yet his vigilance had become the single thread capable of unraveling the boy's carefully constructed identity. Harding understood immediately that the overconfidence Thomas had displayed with the Reverend was a rare misstep, one that could not be ignored. As the investigation deepened, Harding began tracing Thomas's path through multiple counties. Each household he had entered was a study in manipulation and control. Families praised his dedication, unaware that he had orchestrated their loved ones' deaths with a precision that seemed impossible. False references, fabricated histories, carefully timed departures, all were tools in a methodical strategy designed to evade suspicion. What terrified Harding most was the level of sophistication. Thomas was no longer a boy experimenting with cruelty. He had become a strategist, a manipulator who understood not only how to kill but how to bend social systems to his advantage. By nightfall, Harding's journals revealed a pattern so chilling it bordered on the unimaginable. Every death followed a predictable rhythm. Every household fell under the same invisible hand. Every investigation had been carefully anticipated and sidestepped. And yet, here, in the home of Reverend Hartwell, the predator had made his first significant mistake. Harding realized that the boy who had once eluded capture had now underestimated the vigilance of those who had survived him. This overconfidence would be the key to uncovering the truth, the first crack in a facade that had so far seemed impenetrable. The darkness that had followed Timothy Caldwell across state lines had finally been spotted, and the world, still oblivious, had yet to understand the magnitude of what it had allowed to hide in plain sight. Harding's investigation quickly expanded beyond Oskaloosa, unfolding like a map of calculated destruction across the American Midwest. Missouri, Nebraska, Kansas, and Colorado, states separated by miles of plains and forests, suddenly revealed themselves as theaters in a single, relentless experiment. Every death, when viewed individually, had seemed isolated, natural, almost mundane. But as Harding connected the dots, a terrifying pattern emerged. This was not random misfortune. This was design. A boy who had disappeared from Missouri 7 years prior had returned, trained by time and society itself to wield death as both tool and weapon. Families who had welcomed Thomas Whitfield into their homes described a young man whose empathy seemed boundless, whose knowledge of medicine was uncanny, whose dedication to the infirm and dying appeared almost saintly. And yet, beneath the surface, Harding uncovered threads of deceit that were impossible to ignore. False letters, fabricated references, carefully timed absences during patient deaths. These were not mistakes, they were signatures. Thomas had created an invisible trail, one designed to confuse, distract, and mislead. He had weaponized society's assumptions, exploiting the trust placed in him by those most vulnerable. Harding pored over documents, speaking with county officials, physicians, and families. He reconstructed the circuit Thomas had followed, visits lasting 3 to 6 weeks, each patient's decline predicted with eerie accuracy, each departure leaving only grief in its wake. And yet, Thomas had managed to leave no trail significant enough for the authorities to act. Until Hartwell. Until the boy's overconfidence met the Reverend's vigilance. In Oskaloosa, Harding saw the first crack in the armor of this young man who had become a master of human manipulation. What was most disturbing, Harding realized, was the evolutionary nature of Thomas's methods. He had begun as a curious, cruel boy experimenting in isolation, and had emerged as a sophisticated predator. He had learned to disguise his intent, to frame the inevitability of death as compassion, and to disappear before suspicion could crystallize. Society itself had been his accomplice, blinded by gratitude, trust, and the convenient explanations for death that he had orchestrated so meticulously. Each patient had been a controlled study, each family unwitting participants, each death a testament to his skill. And yet, Harding could feel the danger intensifying. Thomas was learning, adapting, evolving with every encounter. His overconfidence with Hartwell was not a fluke. It was the beginning of a dangerous escalation. Harding knew that exposure, if not immediate and precise, could cost dozens more lives before Thomas's cycle was interrupted. The young man's brilliance was inseparable from his cruelty. He had mastered the art of invisibility, hiding in plain sight while he refined the mechanisms of death. And now, the moment was approaching when society's ignorance would meet the sharp edge of truth. Harding's eyes fell on the journals once more. The full scope of the boy's shadowy network was terrifying: patterns of movement, methods of manipulation, the surgical timing of deaths, the extraction of valuables, the false histories, every detail catalogued with obsessive precision. And through it all, one realization struck Harding with a cold clarity. The boy who science could not explain had become something far worse than the world had imagined. He had become a predator who thrived on the system's trust, a manipulator who saw life as a series of experiments and death as the ultimate proof of his mastery. What terrified Dr. Harding more than the deaths themselves was the revelation of the identity Thomas Whitfield had meticulously constructed. Every reference he provided, every grateful family letter, every professional recommendation, it was all a carefully woven fiction. Families that vouched for him in Missouri never existed. Grateful letters he carried were forged or stolen. He had created an entire life out of lies, a persona so credible that no one could have imagined the darkness lurking beneath the polite demeanor and youthful charm. And yet, Harding could see the method behind the madness. Thomas had understood the power of perception, how easily trust could be manipulated, how appearances could cloak intent with terrifying effectiveness. Thomas's skill was not merely deception, it was strategic control. He chose families who were isolated, patients whose illness would mask the timing of death. He arrived with impeccable timing, planting seeds of confidence, offering guidance, support, and expertise. He earned gratitude, he earned trust, he earned complete access. And then, as if rehearsed in some cruel ritual, the patient died on a timeline calculated to perfection. Death itself became a tool, wielded with the precision of a surgeon and the artistry of a master manipulator. It was the ultimate exercise in control, the life of another person shaped, monitored, and ended according to his design, all while society applauded his care. As Harding traced Thomas's circuit through multiple states, the scope of the deception grew horrifying. In Kansas, Missouri, Nebraska, and Colorado, he had repeated the same methodical pattern, always leaving families and authorities convinced of natural death, always disappearing before suspicion could coalesce into accusation. And now, the overconfidence that had led to Reverend Hartwell's survival provided a rare window into his methodology. A glimpse into the man who had become the boy who science couldn't explain, evolved into a predator who could hide in plain sight while orchestrating multiple deaths simultaneously. The sheer audacity of Thomas's planning revealed a mind that understood human psychology at its most vulnerable intersection. He exploited grief, trust, and societal assumptions. He weaponized empathy itself, turning his appearance of care into the ultimate camouflage. Each death was a lesson in invisibility, each manipulation a demonstration of the system's blind spots. Families believed they were blessed with a dedicated caregiver, while in reality they had invited a calculating killer into the most intimate corners of their lives. And yet, Harding sensed a shift. The predator, for all his skill, was beginning to make errors. Patterns repeated, small inconsistencies appeared, and the overconfidence displayed with Reverend Hartwell exposed the first real cracks in the carefully constructed mask. Harding knew these cracks were fragile, but they were all he needed. They were the fragile threads that, when pulled, could unravel the illusion, revealing the full scope of Thomas Whitfield's terrifying reality. The stage was set. The web of lies, death, and control stretched across state lines. But now the men who had once observed him as a boy were closing in. And the boy, now a man, would soon discover that the very systems he exploited might finally catch up with him. By late August, Dr. Harding and Dr. Wheeler were operating as a shadow network of observation and deduction, moving quietly across counties, piecing together the boy-turned-predator's lethal trail. Every detail mattered: the timing of arrivals, the duration of stays, the precise moments of patient decline. They worked methodically, aware that one misstep could allow Thomas Whitfield to vanish again, leaving death in his wake and justice perpetually out of reach. There was no room for error. This was a predator who thrived on invisibility, on exploiting every gap in society's perception. Thomas, meanwhile, continued his routine with a terrifying fluidity. He moved from household to household, his demeanor unchanged, his manners impeccable. Families saw a devoted young man, a savior for their infirm loved ones, oblivious to the deadly calculations behind every interaction. He asked the right questions, gave the right advice, delivered comfort with measured precision, and then, when the time was exact, allowed nature, or so it appeared, to claim the life he had been quietly orchestrating. In each county, the same eerie rhythm played out: trust, care, death, disappearance. And always, Thomas observed with the same calm detachment, as if conducting an experiment whose outcome was inevitable. But now, Harding and Wheeler had begun to read the patterns that had once been invisible. Each absence, each sudden departure, each death falling just after his weeks of care, all were catalogued, scrutinized, and mapped. They began to understand the choreography of the boy who had become a man capable of exploiting grief, empathy, and human expectation as though they were instruments in his personal symphony of control. And it was here, in these meticulously documented patterns, that the first glimmers of strategy emerged, a way to anticipate Thomas, to predict his next move, and perhaps to trap him before more lives were lost. What made the danger so immediate was not only Thomas's intelligence, but the thrill he seemed to derive from his own perfection. He was a student of human behavior, and he had learned to manipulate the very systems meant to protect the vulnerable. Every hospital record, every death certificate, every family's recollection was weaponized by him, and yet his growing arrogance, the belief that his camouflage was flawless, began to betray him. Hartwell's survival was proof enough that the predator, as skilled as he was, had vulnerabilities. As night fell over Oskaloosa, Harding and Wheeler met in hushed secrecy, their conversation tense with the weight of what they had uncovered. They spoke of strategies, of the need for patience, and of the inevitability of Thomas's overreach. The man who had once been a boy experimenting with cruelty was now a calculated killer. But even the most precise calculations could fail when confronted with foresight and vigilance. In that moment, both men understood the gravity of the hunt. This was not simply about stopping a murderer. It was about confronting a mind that had weaponized society's trust, a mind that could manipulate perception itself, and a mind that, if allowed to continue, would leave a trail of invisible corpses stretching across the heart of the Midwest. The chase had begun in earnest, and Thomas Whitfield, for all his brilliance, was now being watched by men who had studied his darkness longer than anyone alive. In the weeks following Harding and Wheeler's silent coordination, Thomas Whitfield continued his calculated work, yet the threads of his carefully woven camouflage were beginning to fray. The boy who had once disappeared without a trace was now emboldened by years of evading suspicion. His precision had become arrogance, his caution laced with confidence that borders on recklessness. He moved through homes with the same polite attentiveness, yet subtle miscalculations began to appear. A question asked too pointedly, a glance lingering too long, a patience routine observed with unnerving intensity. The predator was no longer invisible, his shadow was starting to betray him. Thomas's next victims were selected with the same meticulous care, elderly, infirm, isolated. But with Harding and Wheeler mapping his previous patterns, the ground was subtly shifting beneath him. They had begun predicting his movements, noting the timing of his departures, the exact length of stays that preceded patient decline. And as the adults who had first studied Timothy Caldwell closed in, Thomas's overconfidence pushed him into situations where his control was no longer absolute. The very traits that had allowed him to escape justice for years, the cunning, the charm, the manipulation of trust, were now intersecting with an intelligence that equaled his own. Within the communities he infiltrated, Thomas maintained the facade of the ideal caregiver. Families praised his attention, his knowledge, his soothing presence. Yet cracks appeared. Neighbors whispered about the eerily precise timing of deaths. Local physicians noted the odd coincidences of his presence during multiple fatalities. Subtle inconsistencies in his references began to surface. Thomas, brilliant as he was, could not account for the combined vigilance of two men who had devoted years to studying his behavior, men who now knew the rhythm of his cruelty better than he knew it himself. What made Thomas truly dangerous and terrifying was the psychological mastery he wielded. He had learned to manipulate perception, to exploit grief, to weaponize empathy. He could make a family believe that death was natural, that his presence was a blessing, that their trust was a shield against disaster. And yet, with every overconfident glance, every misstep, the illusion began to erode. Reverend Hartwell's survival had been a warning. Now Harding and Wheeler were preparing to exploit the next flaw, to catch the predator in the precise moment where his arrogance became vulnerability. As Thomas plotted his next move, the invisible web he had cast over multiple states began to tighten around him. The boy who had once toyed with cruelty for curiosity had grown into a man who wielded murder as a tool. But even the most calculated predator cannot control the universe. Patterns, previously invisible to everyone else, were now being read, anticipated, and mapped. The stage was set for confrontation. The moment where Thomas Whitfield's brilliance would collide with foresight and vigilance was approaching, and the outcome could very well determine how many more would live or die under his hands. By early September, Thomas Whitfield's pattern of meticulous care and calculated absence had reached a dangerous crescendo. He moved into his next household with the same calm efficiency, his pale blue eyes observing, cataloging, analyzing every detail of his patient's condition and the family's vulnerabilities. But Harding and Wheeler's network had begun to anticipate his rhythm, their presence invisible yet persistent, like shadows moving through his meticulously arranged world. And now, for the first time in years, Thomas's instinct for self-preservation was being tested. The new household was a wealthy farmstead on the outskirts of Osage County, Kansas, with elderly parents whose health was fragile but not immediately terminal. Thomas entered with the practiced ease of a man who had orchestrated dozens of deaths. Yet here, subtle forces began to interfere with his control. He noted the unusually attentive family members, the local doctor who took meticulous notes, the neighbors who stopped by frequently. The delicate balance he had relied upon for years, the trust of the vulnerable, the isolation of the infirm, was slipping. And yet, he pressed on, confident that his skill, his reputation, and his charm would carry him through. For days, Thomas observed the patients, adjusting routines, administering care, asking questions that seemed innocent but revealed a deeper obsession with documentation, timing, and mortality. He collected details of medications, mapped sleeping patterns, and even inquired about the locations of valuables, always with a politeness that disarmed suspicion. But Harding and Wheeler were watching. They had traced his circuit through multiple counties and had positioned themselves like unseen sentinels, documenting every movement, noting every deviation from his usual rhythm. For the first time, Thomas encountered a subtle resistance he could not immediately neutralize. Then, the misstep occurred. In the quiet hours of a moonlit night, Thomas lingered too long near the bedside of the male patient, adjusting pillows and checking vitals with the precision of someone more interested in experimentation than care. The patient, surprisingly lucid, whispered a question that caught Thomas off guard. He stumbled over a response, a break in his otherwise flawless performance. Harding, observing from a distance, immediately recognized the vulnerability. This small error, a flicker of hesitation, a human reaction in a man who had trained himself to be flawless, was enough to unravel the carefully constructed illusion. What followed was a tense interplay of observation, anticipation, and strategic patience. Harding and Wheeler knew that rushing into confrontation could be catastrophic. Thomas Whitfield was not merely a killer, he was a predator who understood the psychology of fear, trust, and deception. Yet the misstep had occurred, and it was a crack large enough to exploit. Every death, every lie, every manipulated family had led to this pivotal moment. And now, the boy who had escaped the Missouri State Hospital 7 years prior was on the brink of exposure, his mastery of death confronting the first real threat it had ever faced. The tension in the Osage County farmstead had become almost unbearable, a silent pulse vibrating through the rooms, through the air, through the very walls themselves. Thomas Whitfield, for all his intelligence, for all his years of careful preparation, had never faced an adversary who could anticipate his every movement. Harding and Wheeler, moving like shadows across the county, had become the hunters to his hunted, the unseen force patiently waiting for the precise moment to strike. Every patient interaction, every question, every careful adjustment of pillows was now observed not just by families, but by men who had devoted their lives to understanding the darkness that had once been a boy named Timothy Caldwell. Thomas's confidence had begun to crack. He noticed the subtle glances, the strange pauses of visitors, the slight discrepancies in the household routine. For the first time, he felt the unease that he had so often instilled in others. He was no longer the master of invisibility. The predator was beginning to sense the circling presence of those who had spent years decoding him, and the weight of inevitable exposure pressed upon him like an unseen hand tightening around his chest. He moved through the house with practiced politeness, yet there was a tension in his every motion, a hesitation in his otherwise flawless demeanor. That night, Harding and Wheeler made their move. Not with confrontation, not with accusation, but with the subtle orchestration of observation and containment. They documented, photographed, and cross-referenced every interaction, every detail of Thomas's routine, ensuring that when the moment came, the full extent of his manipulation, his lies, and his murders could be revealed beyond doubt. This was not a simple capture, it was the dismantling of a carefully constructed empire of cruelty. Every journal, every false letter, every orchestrated death would now be exposed, stripping Thomas of the cloak of trust he had worn for so long. In the quiet of the night, Harding allowed himself a moment of grim reflection. This was the boy who had experimented with cruelty, the child who had disappeared from the Missouri State Hospital, who had grown into a predator capable of exploiting society's most basic assumptions. But now, that predator's reach had met the precision and patience of men who understood him better than he understood himself. The cycle of manipulation, the pattern of clinical murder, and the exploitation of trust were about to be unmasked. And yet, even in the face of inevitable exposure, Thomas Whitfield remained unnervingly calm. There was no screaming, no panic, no betrayal of fear, only the cold, calculating gaze of a man who had lived a lifetime of deception. For Harding and Wheeler, it was a chilling reminder that darkness does not always scream. It waits, it calculates, it lingers, even when its dominion is ending. And as dawn approached over the fields of Osage County, one truth became terrifyingly clear: a life built on manipulation, on careful cruelty, on weaponized empathy can be interrupted, contained, and revealed. But the shadow it casts over those who witnessed it lasts forever. Thomas Whitfield had been caught, yes, but the echo of the boy's science could not explain. The boy who became a predator would haunt the Midwest, the investigators, and anyone who glimpsed his terrifying mind long after the doors of the farmstead were closed behind him. And for those who now know his story, a deeper truth emerges: the world can harbor monsters hiding in plain sight, and the line between care and control, trust and terror, can be thinner than you ever imagined.